Today we have Randolph Brazier from ENA UK. He's Director of Innovation and Electricity Systems. He's going to have a presentation, probably runs about 20 minutes without questions, but Randolph's quite happy to take questions as we go along the way. So with that, I will leave it open to Randolph to kick this off. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jeff. I'll just share my screen. 1 second. Let me know when that comes up.
Yes, we can see it now. Yep.
Brilliant. Yeah. So as Jeff said, probably I've got about 20 slides here. They sort of probably take 20-25 minutes, but I prefer a more sort of informal and in-depth session. So if people do want to jump in along the way, feel free to put your hand up or put something in the chat and I'll try and monitor it. So yeah, as Jeff said, I work for a company called the ENA, Energy Networks Association. We represent all the gas and electricity networks in the UK and Ireland at both a transmission level and a distribution level. So today I'm going to, as per the topic, broadly focus on the electricity side of the business and also specifically flexibility. But as I'll say, there's quite a few links to gas as well. To give you an idea, the UK has very high gas usage for the purposes of home heating, cooking and hot water. It's around about 87% of properties have a connection to the gas network. And our gas peak in winter in kilowatts equivalent is around about 4 to 6 times our electrical peak, which is about 50 gigawatts. So you can see the size of the gas networks and hence the challenge of obviously trying to decarbonize that. Right. So I won't dwell on this because you guys know it, but in terms of the challenge, obviously, we call it 3 Ds here: digitalization, decentralization, decarbonisation. And we've seen a massive shift in the UK. We've gone from around about 90 centralised large-scale power generators, mainly coal, gas and nuclear, to millions of devices connected all over the grid. And I've got some stats on that, so I won't dwell on that. We broadly think of it as the energy trilemma, which is trying to balance effectively cost, reliability and sustainability. So from a sustainability perspective, we have a net zero target by 2050. We have significant amount of renewables and DER rollout. However, we need to maintain our energy security, which is quite high in the UK, and we have quite good reliability here. However, we're seeing increasing storms, increasing in terms of number and severity. We have had various cyber attacks fairly recently. We have a range of ways in which we're connected to global energy markets, either physically via cables and pipes or exposure to LNG. So that makes the energy security side challenging. And then finally, there's obviously an energy crisis at the moment. The cost of gas is high. We have big debates over who should be paying for what. We've been quite economic with our build out of the energy system in the UK, but what that means is that we've probably underinvested for about 20 to 30 years. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. My laptop just decided to restart. I hope it wasn't one of those cyber attacks I was just talking about.
Oh, good.
Apologies. Let me just continue. So, a lot of the changes that are happening here are very much driven by government policy. So we mentioned the net zero target. We got a range of different plans, policies, papers that drive towards net zero. And it's quite interesting to note that we actually have a smart grid strategy in the UK, which is quite unusual for to have a specific dedicated policy from government on smart grid. The only other thing I'll note here is that one of the keys to success is not only the bipartisan political situation, but also the regulatory model. So our regulator is Ofgem in this country, and networks are unbundled. So T&D are effectively separated in terms of ownership, not allowed to own generation, etc. And we're governed by a regulatory framework called the RIIO model, which, as you can see there, stands for revenue equals incentives plus innovation plus output. And the key thing to note here is that this is an output-based framework, which includes a TOTEX mechanism. So what I mean there is that we as networks are incentivized to deliver a reliable service and reliable capacity to customers. And the cheaper that we do that, regardless of the solution, the more incentives we have, the more returns we make. So what that means is we don't favour build over non-build solutions. We favour the cheapest solution. And that is absolutely essential to what I'm about to tell you. If we didn't have that, alongside the innovation part of the framework as well, which I'll also talk about, there would be no incentive for a regulated monopoly to do what we're doing, apart from goodwill, which is not good enough, really. So it's been quite successful. However, obviously it's not perfect. There's more that needs to be done, needs to become more agile, etc. But this is the policy, and the regulation is the fundamental basis of why we're doing what we're doing. So in terms of progress to date, we've got around 43% renewables on the grid. It goes up to about 63% if you include nuclear power as a low carbon technology. But during that's total volume of energy across the year in GB. However, during certain periods of the year, we have much higher percentage than that. So as you can see, that at the end of January, we had about 2/3 of the electrical mix purely from onshore and offshore wind. That record was broken recently in terms of gigawatts, but not in terms of percentage generation. We've got that number's out of date every time I present this, but we've got around about 900,000 electric vehicles on the road, which is not actually that high an absolute number, considering we've got over 20 million cars. But the sales rates of electric vehicles are double-digit percentages month on month. So the uptake rate is fast. We've got around about, yeah.
Just one question relating to the previous slide. Can you enlighten us on the benefits from TOTEX for distributors?
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that later. I'll just hold that because I've got a slide on that basically.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so we've got about 30 gigawatts of distributed generation connected to our distribution networks, which is around about 40% of our total installed capacity, and around about 85% of that is renewable, mainly wind and solar. We've got a whole range of hydrogen projects. That's a big focus of ours going forward. And we've got the world's largest local flexibility markets, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Right. This slide's not really for you guys. It's more for a less informed audience. But obviously, to try and connect all this, we need a smart grid. We don't have a definition of this, but we like to think of it in terms of 5 key areas: coordination and collaboration, control and automation, flexibility, data and digital, and innovation. And these are largely the areas that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to focus quite a bit on flexibility, but all the other points you'll see are relevant as well.
Can I ask a quick question about that?
Of course.
You mentioned the smart grid policy, but based on what you just said, it sounds like they didn't attempt to define what a smart grid is in the smart grid policy. So how does that work from the policy standpoint?
Well, they define a smart, flexible energy system because they they're basically not picking winners on vectors. So they talk about an energy system that is transitioning and how that will become smart, but it could be read as a smart grid policy. But yeah, it's officially called the Smart Systems and Flexibility Plan. But you know, reading between the lines, it's a smart grid policy. But it hasn't been explicitly defined. But it has a range of actions. I think 31 actions that basically, if we implement those actions, you will effectively have a smart grid. But I think it was quite clever in that it didn't define that, because one, it would set, you know, it would be too rigid. You know, we still don't even really know what a smart grid will look like in the future. So defining it would be too rigid. It would set an international standard, which I don't think they wanted to do. And also it would be too heavily focused on electricity. Okay, so what's our strategy for enabling this at ENA? So we have 2 projects that are looking at effectively a strategy for rolling out that smart, flexible energy system. So on the electricity side, we've got our Open Networks project. That's the one on the left there with the beaver. That is our strategy for rolling it out. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. And then on the right-hand side, we have our sort of sister project, the Gas Goes Green project, which is a project at looking at converting the gas grid to a green gas, which will likely be hydrogen, but there might be some biomethane involved there. And it's looking at developing the world's first zero carbon gas grid. As I said, the peak is 4 to 6 times the electrical peak, so it's a significant challenge. I think even the gas networks admit that the volumes and the peak in the future won't be what they are today, so a significant chunk will be electrified. However, all of our members agree that it's virtually impossible to electrify everything that uses gas in this country. But these 2 projects are heavily linked, as I'll show on the next slide. We have basically this little table, blue and green table on the right-hand side, is the work streams for the Open Networks project. And you'll see that the last green work stream is a whole energy systems work stream. So this is where it's a joint work stream between those 2 projects, looking at whole energy systems issues and how we can better facilitate a whole systems approach across the gas and electricity networks. And this is on all timescales. So in the UK, the electrical peak corresponds to a gas peak, because when we have an electrical peak, typically it's met by CCGTs in the UK, which obviously use gas, and that creates a peak on the gas networks. Similarly, in planning timescales, when we make a decision about something, there's often a choice between a gas solution, an electricity solution, or a combined solution. So, for example, if you've got a lot of wind in a specific area that's in a highly constrained region, you have a normal solution, could be to build a bigger grid, build a new transmission line or something like that. But another solution could be to potentially produce hydrogen or something else gas related in the area and blend that into the gas network. So we're looking at it from a planning perspective as well. I started with the last work stream, weirdly, but the other work streams that the project's looking at, there's an overarching DSO transition work stream, which is looking at effectively what the roadmap is for transitioning to a more active system operator at DSO level. I'll talk a bit more about that. Flex services, which I'm going to talk about today. Better coordination between T&D. Coordination between T&D is decent in this country, but not fantastic. There's still a long way to go. How to better facilitate connections for customers. We're expecting, by the end of this decade, 4,000 electric vehicle charge points being connected per day, which is pretty scary. And then our final work stream is a sort of stakeholder engagement one that effectively supports the other 5 work streams. So what is a DSO? So you may be aware that in this country, we call distribution networks DNOs, or distribution network operators. And you'll often hear me referring to that. Part of the plan is to try and transition them to DSOs, so effectively moving them from passive asset owners to active system operators, similar to what happens at the transmission level. So one of those work streams, the DSO transition work stream, has developed effectively a plan or a roadmap which has 8 functions. We defined 8 functions for the DSO with a range of sub-activities under those functions. And we've created an interactive roadmap, as you can sort of see there in the bottom right-hand side, where we basically say what the function and activity is, how and when it has been implemented, if it already has been implemented, and if it hasn't, what the plan is to implement it going forward. And we break that down per DNO. There's 6 DNOs in GB, and I think we've added the Irish to that roadmap as well. And that roadmap is interactive, and it's publicly available on our website. So obviously a key part of the DSO is flexibility and enabling flexibility. It's also equally a very important part for the transmission grid as well, and our electricity system operator. Again, this slide is probably for a less informed audience, but there's obviously a range of sources of flexibility. From a networks perspective, we are technology agnostic in that we don't favour one solution over another. And under EU law, which is also now British law, we are only allowed to own and operate the last source of flexibility there, which is effectively network hardware, software. So this is sources of flexibility such as automatic grid switching, capacitor banks, although that's even quite controversial as to whether we'll be able to own them in the future, transformer tapping, things like that, dynamic line rating, those sorts of technologies. They're the only sources of flexibility that we are allowed to own and operate as networks. And while it gives you a bit of flex, buys you a bit of time, ultimately it doesn't provide anywhere near the amount of flexibility that we're going to need, both at a national and a local level. So it's decent, but it's not that good. So because we're not allowed to own and operate that, we need to access flexibility via market mechanisms. And again, in this country, I mean, this is a very simplified view of it, but this is my sort of layman's way to think about it. We have 3 layers of markets. We have national markets, we have local markets, and then we've got emerging sort of hyper local markets. So from a national perspective, we have our wholesale market, and then to support the wholesale market, to balance the, supposedly the final 2 to 3%, we've got a balancing mechanism and associated ancillary services. We also have a capacity market for situations where we basically don't have enough capacity effectively during winter, long dark periods during winter, which is actually never been used, but is seen as a very needed safety net. So the wholesale market is obviously completely open, and there's a range of different marketplaces that you can buy and trade energy long-term or short-term. And then the balancing and ancillary services market and the capacity market is facilitated by our transmission system operator, which is called National Grid ESO, which is actually what Mark Herring used to work at. And the ESO is now a legally separate entity from the transmission owner. And indeed, the government has now decided to go even one step further and make it an independent system operator, effectively buy it back off National Grid and expand its scope. in terms of the functions that it will undertake. Though those markets at the national level, with the exception of the capacity market, have in one form or another been happening since liberalisation in the 90s. But obviously they're evolving quite significantly to allow smaller devices, smaller distributed resources to participate in those markets. And also the markets are looking at a national level, they're looking at things like markets for inertia, which obviously was effectively a free service that that National Grid could access, or didn't need to access, they just got it previously, but obviously going forward that you don't just get it, so they're looking at what market mechanisms you can have to bring more inertia onto the system. And we're learning quite a lot from Ireland there. They already have an inertia market, which is pretty exciting. So that's what's happening nationally. So, you know, it existed, but it's evolving. That's how I think of it. You've then got the local markets, which is what I'm going to focus on the next few slides. That is markets that now exist at distribution level that didn't exist pre-2019. And that's a big focus of Open Networks and my team specifically. You've then got these emerging markets at a hyper local level, peer-to-peer trading, vehicle to home services, vehicle to grid, vehicle to next door neighbor, things like that, which we don't really know how they're going to work yet. Community energy markets and things like that. We don't quite understand how they're going to work in terms of the other markets, but they're emerging areas of research, and there's a lot of innovation focused in those areas going forward. So as I said, Open Networks is looking to facilitate the middle layer, the local markets, and also ensure connectivity and collaboration and stackability of services between the other ones. So, as I said, the distribution networks, there was no market there before. They were basically passive asset owners. So around about 2019, we made a flexibility commitment where the networks basically said, where we have congestion, we will test the market to see if the market can solve that congestion via a service. And if the market can, and the cost that they offer that service at is lower than the cost of a network solution, which could be either a traditional reinforcement solution or one of those smart grid solutions that I talked about, then we have committed to procuring that service from the third party. And basically to do this, we need to set up local flexibility markets. Now, to answer the question earlier from, I think it was Dale, about TOTEX. This comes to the heart of TOTEX. If, let's say we're procuring a service from a battery, for argument's sake, if we procure the service from the battery and the cost of procuring that service is lower than the CapEx option, so the build option, effectively what happens is, under a TOTEX mechanism, effectively the CapEx moves to the OpEx. That's how you could think of it. What happens in reality is that the money is just allocated differently. And that saving between the cost of the asset and the flexibility service that we paid for, there's obviously a saving there. We get to keep a percentage of that saving as effectively profit, and the rest of the saving basically comes off the customer bill. So that's why the TOTEX mechanism is so important, because we're incentivized to find the lowest cost solution, because when we find that solution that's lower cost, we get a cut of the saving. Now that goes even for build solutions. So let's say we say that a cable is going to cost £1 million, but some sort of innovative technique, you know, we maybe put dynamic line rating on the existing asset, sweat it further or something like that, and it costs us £500,000. Again, we get a cut of that £500,000 saving. we're incentivized to find the lowest cost solution, not put more copper in the ground, as we would say. That's how the TOTEX mechanism works. That's why we're incentivized to procure flexibility. That's why these markets exist, ultimately. It's not goodwill. I see a hand up from Sean.
Yeah, hi Randolph. It all links around the congestion. So how do you determine the congestion? At what sort of levels on the distribution network?
It's a very good question. So at the moment, as I'll show you in a minute, we are procuring flexibility at 132, 33, 11 kV, and now even some LV. And the way that you determine the congestion is ultimately with monitoring. So we basically, this is something that we say to the regulator. We need LV monitoring, or whatever the voltage level is. We need monitoring at those feeders, at those transformers, to ensure that we can measure the congestion accurately. It's also obviously based on a combination of the monitoring plus your forecasting, because you're obviously doing this in advance. You're not doing it last. These aren't real-time markets. We're not doing this last minute. We're typically procuring season ahead. So it's also based on intense forecasting and stakeholder engagement, so that we understand where the demand is, where it's coming, where it's expected to go, etc. I should say that eventually the intention is for these markets to become near real time. However, we're not there yet. The demand is relatively, I say this with a sense of trepidation, it must be said, but the demand is relatively predictable at this stage. We typically know that our peaks are between 5 and 10 p.m. in winter. However, that's obviously changing. And when you're talking about LV, that doesn't always strictly stay true. Right, so what does it mean in numbers? So this slide, there's a lot going on here, admittedly, but let me try and talk through it. So at the end of the day, last year, these numbers on this slide are to the end of August. I haven't updated the slide, but basically we put out to tender over 3 gigawatts of local flexibility services on a postcode by postcode basis across 4 products, which we standardized under the Open Networks project. Effectively, I mean, you can read the definition of the products and everything we need in terms of ramp rates and all that sort of stuff, but effectively the 4 products are scheduled constraint management, which I call just, it's a constraint under normal operation of the network. Pre and post fault constraint management, and then long-term restoration. So, we've had a transformer fire or something, and we're going to have a transformer out for, say, 4 months while we replace it. So long-term restoration. The flexibility that we're procuring is across those services. The services are not mutually exclusive, so you can stack, you can get contracts between those real power products. And for the eagle-eyed there, you will see that there's a 5th column there, a 5th service for reactive power. The standardized products are effectively for thermal constraints. However, we are starting to dabble with reactive power and voltage support at distribution. We don't have standardized products on this though. This is a new area of investigation. And as you can see from the bottom, either in the white table or the graph, what we're putting out to tender is in orange, and what we're actually physically contracting, so signing a contract to provide a service. So what this means is that we're not getting everything that we need. The markets aren't liquid yet, and basically there's a range of reasons for this, and it's highly locational. In some areas, we get more than 100% of what we want. In other areas, we get nothing. So there's a real mix across the country. But as you can see, as the end of August last year, we already had matched what we'd contracted by the end of the year before. And I think it's around about 70% of what we actually contracted last year, although don't quote me on that. I need to check. All these stats are on our website. In terms of what we're doing at Open Networks, I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but we're standardizing every step in the process. So we're basically standardizing the visibility, the forecasting, the procurement, dispatch, settlement, reporting. However, as I said, the constraints are highly locational. So we need to get more liquidity into the market. So there's a range of things that we're doing to get that liquidity, to increase the amount of participation. So we've created common products. We're increasing and improving how we make the needs visible and accessible, including creating a standardized API to provide the service, standardizing the contract. So we now have a single flexibility contract across all distribution networks in the UK, removing exclusivity, because the value of these networks, the value of these services is ultimately not that high. Investors have told us it might be 10 to 15% of their annual revenue stream. The cost is around about, the average cost is about £300 a megawatt hour, which is significantly higher than the wholesale market cost. However, the utilization of that is relatively low because it's only certain peak periods during winter. We also provide an arming fee, but it's much lower. It's £5 to £10. Better monitoring, lowering barriers to entry in terms of size, in terms of the size of the units participating, trying not to be sizist, so that any sized asset can participate. And also, the better coordination, like I mentioned. I realise that we're already at half an hour, so I'll try and skip through these. Data and digital is obviously a key enabler to all this. So we're making everything more available, better utilising smart meter data, better utilising LV monitoring, creating a single map across the country so that people can access, digitalising the connections process. But also key to all of this is that one of the I's in Rio stands for innovation. And innovation, all of what we're doing, which is now business as usual, started with innovation. So if you think about the reactive power, I told you that's emerging. We're trialing and testing that in the innovation funding that we get. Once we've proved it there, then it will come into Open Networks and become part of the business as usual activity. So the innovation funding, dedicated network innovation funding, not some random government pot of funding that any man and his dog can access. This is like dedicated innovation funding is absolutely critical to getting all this up and running. And you can see all the projects. I'm sure Evie worked in this, so she can teach you more about what happens in innovation and how you can access the data and all that sort of thing. We also have a common strategy at ENA highlighting sort of key themes and areas that we need to focus on going forward. So I think this is the last real slide, but basically some of the new areas that we're using that innovation funding to look at. I mentioned what's happening at LV and digital systems, price-driven flexibility. All of what I've talked about today is what we call explicit flexibility, so it's market-driven. However, there's implicit flexibility as well, which is sort of throwing out a price signal and seeing how people respond. New forms of storage, including seasonal storage. There's no such market for seasonal storage at the moment. V2G and V2H and the role that it can play in networks. Aggregation and service models for energy and mobility. AI and machine learning, community energy schemes and peer-to-peer trading, some of those new markets in that bottom layer, etc. I'll probably pause it there. There's a lot more links and ways to get involved in the deck, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have or explore any of those topics further, or indeed talk about topics that we haven't discussed.
John has a question.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Randolph. I was quite intrigued by actually one point that was on a few slides back at the end, and it was down the bottom, and I was wondering if you could talk to it a bit more about the need for stakeholder engagement.
Right.
That
Yep.
strikes me as a really underappreciated aspect of this, that we actually have to go and talk to people and communities. If we want to build up these markets, we've got to go and talk to the people who are going to participate in them. I'm wondering if you can just talk to that a bit more and what the experience of the ENA in the UK is a bit.
Yeah, I brushed over that, didn't I? And
Yeah,
it's
probably
the most important part.
Well, yeah, I think it is as well, and so I'd like to, to talk. Yeah, I was wondering if you can talk to that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, the stakeholder engagement is absolutely critical to all of this, because we are talking about highly localized constraints, which means that your liquidity or your pool of assets is significantly reduced. If you're thinking about an LV feeder, you've only got whoever's on that street to help you. So you've got to get them, engaged, got to get them involved. Now, there's two aspects to this. One is trust. So when we first came along and started telling people about that, there was zero trust with the network. A monopoly network. Who even are you? We never even heard of you. So we had to spend a lot of time, years, building up trust with people as to the viability of these markets, and that they could actually save money and make money indeed from these markets. So we spent a lot of time doing road shows, local workshops, meetings with trade associations, webinars, all this sort of stuff, to try and build that trust and that relationship. And indeed, that's why we called the project Open Networks, because we want everything to be open and accessible, and everything that I've talked about is available on our website. It's public knowledge, because it was about building that trust. Now, that trust takes time to build. So as you saw in that slide where I talked about the uptake rate of Flex, we only procured 20% of what we needed in the first year. And a lot of that, it wasn't so much down to knowledge. It was more about trust. So when we first put out the sort of call for interest in these areas, people were like, not sure about this, don't really know if I trust it. And indeed, the people who even participated, they didn't want us to automatically trigger their plant to turn up or turn down. So we had to send them an email, for example. But then as the trust slowly grows over the years, then they're like, oh no, just wire it straight through to my off button. And the trust just builds up over time. So yeah, the stakeholder engagement is critical. So that's the first part, the trust. The second part is going to be the technology, because ultimately in this country, distribution networks do not have relationships with residential customers. We have what we call the supplier hub model, which means that customers only deal with retailers. And because of the unbundling rules, that means the retailers aren't the networks. So what we need is the retailers, or the suppliers, as we call them, to reflect our markets down into customers' bills. So we work very hard with the retailers and suppliers to basically get them to engage so that they can offer this down to their customers. Now, I'm under no illusion that for the sake of a few quid a year, a residential customer is not going to be flicking things on and off to relieve network congestion. And this is where the suppliers need to get smart. They need to have a lot more automation in the home, offer energy as a service and things like that, so that all the flexing of devices happens automatically, and no one has to actually physically respond to anything, because it's all done in an automated manner. I should also say that we have a very strong challenge. We call it a challenge group, with around about, I think it's about 30 industry experts that basically challenge and critique all of the outputs from the Open Networks project. And it's like the UN Security Council. They basically have veto rights on the outputs of this project. So everything we put out is basically signed up to by industry, because we say that we can't publish it unless they sign it off.
We have a hand from Evie.
Yes.
Hey Randolph, yeah, super useful just to have all of that sort of reinforced the knowledge from the UK. On the related to the point you were making about that challenge group, New Zealand's obviously a much smaller country, but we've got a lot more EDBs, 29 EDBs. We've got 2 regulators in the electricity side of things, and yeah, there's a lot more parties to try to coordinate between. I just wondered if you could share any insights you've got around the right level of engagement from industry, from government, and from the regulator in coordinating this type of massive transition.
Yeah, it's a good question, Evie. So I think when you're starting this journey, to be frank, it can start bottom up via innovation projects, but if you just leave it within the innovation teams, you'll do a great project and a great pilot, but it will just stall at that point in time, and you won't be able to roll it out to business as usual. So what you need is basically, you need board buy-in, so you need CEO buy-in. That's absolutely critical. Once you've got the CEO buy-in, you can use sort of some coordinating body, probably this forum, I suppose, to form a project to sort of roll it out in a standardized manner. And the reason you want to roll it out in a standardized manner is twofold. One, if there's 29 of you, you're typically probably smaller, have less money, so pooling resources is just efficient. But two, you don't open yourself up to the political risk of having customers having different experiences across the country. You drive consistency across the country, which politically is critical. And then in terms of regulatory and government buy-in, well, we basically have that the smart grid policy, which effectively has written into the policy that Open Networks will deliver the smart grid. That's obviously a great mandate to have, but that takes a lot of lobbying, and it may not be politically possible. So if you can't get that, the other thing we did is to bring regulator and government into the project. So they sit on our steering group for the project, and again, like UN Security Council, they have a veto vote. So what that means is when something comes up to the steering group for approval, let's say it's a new product, a new service, sorry, they sign it off as much as everyone else does. It doesn't then go to them for approval. They're part of the project, so they're part of the development. They also sit in all the work streams, government and the regulator. So they effectively help the development of the products and sign them off. It's not an industry project that then goes up to them for sign off and approval, because you can imagine how slow that would be. So yeah, you basically need, start with the innovation. That's the bottom up. Definitely need that. You've got to prove it works, right? You've got to learn by doing. But then get the board level CEO buy-in with you need financial input, because you'll need to hire consultants and all that sort of jazz. But you also need resource input. So we got the CEOs to commit to between 4 and 6 full-time FTEs, full-time equivalent employees, dedicated to the Open Networks project across their company. Now that's not 4 people, it might be spread across 15 people, but we got that. That's the level of input we got, 4 to 6, but you have to get them to sign that off, otherwise it would never be rolled into business as usual.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's super useful. Thanks, Randolph.
Thanks. We have a question from Peter.
Yeah, thank you. Look, just a question about the that comes back to what we were talking about before about the what you talked about, what we call the separation of loans and energy businesses, about what the two parts can do. Where do batteries fit in?
Well, so we're not allowed to own and operate energy storage, which obviously includes batteries. So what that means is that we're technology agnostic when we're running our flexibility markets. So what that means is that we define the product that we need or the service, and if batteries can provide that service at a lower cost, we'll procure it from them, but we don't actually own and operate it. So we treat it as if it's any other flexible asset providing a service into a market.
Great, thank you. Are there any, is a question from Matt, and then Randolph, I think we'll look for closing comments. Oh, and there's one more from Sean. So we'll do Matt, Sean, and then closing comments.
Sure.
Matt.
Somewhat related to that last question, and I suppose there's two questions bundled in here, but you mentioned cyber attacks before, and I was curious if there was an element of that consideration with consumer devices being part of a flexibility service. And then following on to your point about being technology agnostic, and if a device can provide the service, you'll take it. Do you do some sort of pre-screening or evidence that whatever they're bidding in can actually do what they say it can do, or do you just sort of trust them and they face penalties or be kicked out of the program if they don't perform?
Yeah, good question. So I'll start with the latter one. So we do pre-qualify our assets. We are creating a single asset register, which basically will say what the asset is, what its capability is, what services it's providing, etc. Although we do have issues around, competition there, so we need to be a bit careful. But yeah, we do pre-qualify and test the assets. And in terms of non-delivery, the national markets have very strict non-delivery penalties, which are well established. We started with penalties at distribution. However, we found that was one of the barriers to liquidity, actually. And investors were telling us that by having penalties, the barrier to entry is too high for such a nascent market. So we have actually removed all penalties at the moment. The only penalties are effectively, you don't get paid for the service. However, we do see the penalties phasing in over time for non-delivery. And the reason why is because what that's resulted in is us over procuring for resilience reasons. We over procure because we have to assume some level of non-delivery, which is obviously not ideal and means you could be paying overs. We didn't get to touch on it, but we're also fixing the cost, which is quite interesting, which again means we could be paying overs. But the reason we're fixing the cost is to drive stability or drive confidence in the market. We basically fix the cost up to 100% of what we need. If we get bids more than 100% of bids, then we go to an auction-based mechanism. And then the first question was on cyber, wasn't it? Yeah. Cyber is an interesting one. I've got a cyber guy in my team who loves it. Yes, cyber is an issue, and the security services here are on our back all the time, and you got millions of potential devices connecting to the grid and all that sort of jazz. So it is something that we need to consider, and we have, we spend a lot of time and money on cyber. We work with all the, MI5 and all those sorts of guys to ensure that what we're doing is, best practice and aligned with what government want. The one thing I'll say though is don't let cybersecurity stop you from doing stuff. I would argue that by having millions of devices generating power as opposed to less than 100, you're actually increasing your resilience. You're less reliant on certain pieces of plant, and actually you potentially have a more stable system because you don't have big, if you have a fault somewhere and you lose a big unit, like you were saying this morning, 200 megawatts, that causes a big shock on the system. That screws your frequency, right? If you're losing just a couple here and there because they're much smaller, you could potentially increase your resilience. So yes, it's a challenge. Yes, we've got to focus on it, but don't let it be an excuse to not doing things.
Great. Final question from Sean, and we just have a couple of minutes and then wrap. Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Randolph. I could ask heaps more than one question, and I'm trying to go where I'm going to go here. I'm going to assume you guys are setting the quality standards for the technical standards for the flexibility providers and assets that are connected. You guys are doing that? And
yes, we are, yes.
And when you talked around the batteries, are those the residential type batteries, the Teslas and that are actually onto houses, or are they big, more commercial type?
Yeah, so we set the connection standards for all generation devices, and we count storage as generation. The EU did that, so we did the same. And our connection standards that we have at ENA are for all size devices. They are phased, so there's different standards for different size devices, but we do set the standards for all devices of all sizes.
Awesome.
And that includes, it must be said, that includes demand. So legally, under our connection code, if you install a device, any generation device, you have to tell us as networks, and it's a bit loosely defined, admittedly, but any significant demand, you also need to notify the network of. So that includes obviously EV charge points, heat pumps, electric showers, electric ovens, all these sorts of things. Technically, you need to tell the network. Now, of course, a lot of people don't, because there's no incentive to do that. So, and we don't want to be, taking a stick approach to residential customers. So we're trying to create like incentives to tell us.
Thank you. I did have one other, and that was and it's just a project we're on. There's a few of them here who are on the project. Likely know I'm going to ask it. Communication systems, what are you using? What's your systems? I'm thinking 2030.5 or an OpenADR type approach.
Yeah, that's one thing we haven't standardized yet. It's a bit of a mix, I would say. Some are using standards like OpenADR, DMP3, like all these sorts of things. Some have their own private wire telecom systems.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a mix. Unfortunately, that's something that we're trying to standardize. And
is that causing you big issues?
The suppliers get it, as in the flexibility providers, they get a bit frustrated with things like that. But I wouldn't say that's their biggest gripe, to be honest.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll stop now. Thanks, Jeff.
Great, thank you. Thanks. Randolph, thanks so much for the presentation. I wonder if in your closing comments, you could just share with us, and you talked to this a bit before with Evie's question, sort of ideas, things to think about as we in New Zealand think about this transition stuff you've gone through.
Yeah. So I think you need innovation first. You've got to prove the stuff works. So get moving on innovation and get some dedicated funding for it. That might involve quite heavy lobbying, but you have to do it. Because if you can't try, a regulated monopoly has very little incentive to innovate, because there's no competition. So you need to try and get innovation funding, probably from the regulator. Get senior buy-in to doing this. So you have to get the CEO signed up. It's just that simple. You can't do it with anything less than that. Get the senior buy-in. get out of competition mode. I don't know if this is the case in New Zealand, but get out of competition mode between DNOs. There's 29 of you. You're not in competition with each other. You're monopolies in a certain area. Get working together. Pool your assets, pool your resources. It's going to save you time, it's going to save you money, and it's going to drive consistent customer experience across the country. That's critical to get the political buy-in that you will need later. And then I think it goes back to John's point. Then once you've got that in place and you start doing things, get the stakeholders on board, bring them on the journey, get them signed up. You know, regulator and government, bring them into the fold. You know, make them one of the decision makers so that you've got inherent sign-off. And then my final point that I would highlight is don't let perfection be the enemy of good. You know, we're evolving all the time, you know, changing things, tweaking things, updating things. You're not going to get it perfect first time. You've got to learn by doing. You know, we've made so many mistakes, and you just recorrect the ship, right? It's not a bad thing.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks to everybody who joined. The session has been recorded, so should be available at a later date. Well, thanks very much. And well, that concludes the session.
Thanks for having me, guys. Nice to meet you.
Thanks very much, Randolph. Thanks, Tom.
Really appreciate that, Randolph.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Randolph. Have a good day.